The iron shackles bit into Chief Makoa's wrists as two soldiers dragged him across the scorched earth of the British colonial fort. His bare feet scraped against loose gravel, leaving thin trails of blood behind him. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, turning the parade ground into a furnace. Sweat poured down his weathered face, but his dark eyes remained defiant, staring straight ahead at the wooden execution post that awaited him. Sarah Bennett stood among the crowd of British officers and settlers who had gathered to witness the execution. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the leather journal pressed against her chest. As the official translator for the East Africa Protectorate, she had spent 3 years learning the languages and customs of the local tribes. She had translated countless documents, mediated disputes, and served as the bridge between two vastly different worlds. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for this moment. The charges against Chief Makoa were severe. 3 British merchants had been murdered in their sleep at a trading post near the Tana River. Their throats had been cut, their goods stolen, and their bodies left for the vultures. When the colonial police investigated, they found a ceremonial knife belonging to Makoa hidden beneath one of the merchants' cots. The evidence seemed irrefutable. The chief had been arrested, tried in a court where he barely understood the proceedings, and sentenced to hang within a fortnight. Sarah had translated during the trial, watching helplessly as the prosecution built its case. She had seen the confusion in Makoa's eyes when the judge pronounced the death sentence. Through her translations, he had maintained his innocence, insisting that his knife had been stolen weeks before the murders. But the British magistrate dismissed his claims as the desperate lies of a guilty man. Colonial justice moved swiftly, and mercy was a luxury rarely extended to natives accused of killing white men. As the soldiers secured Makoa to the execution post, Sarah's mind raced back to a conversation she had overheard 3 days earlier. She had been working late in the administrative office, translating land deeds, when 2 soldiers entered the adjacent room. They hadn't noticed her presence behind the half-open door. Their voices carried clearly through the thin walls as they shared a bottle of whiskey and talked freely. The first soldier, a corporal named Davies, had laughed about something. His companion, Private Hutchins, had joined in. Then Davies said something that made Sarah's blood run cold. He mentioned the trading post murders and made a crude joke about how easy it had been to frame the savage chief. Hutchins had warned him to keep his voice down, but Davies was drunk and careless. He bragged about how he and 2 other soldiers had killed the merchants to steal their ivory shipment. They had used Makoa's ceremonial knife, which they had taken from his village during a routine patrol weeks earlier. Sarah had frozen behind her desk, hardly daring to breathe. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared they might hear it. The soldiers continued talking, revealing more details. They had buried the stolen ivory in the forest, planning to dig it up after the execution when suspicion had died down. They had even discussed how to split the profits once they sold it to Portuguese traders on the coast. After 20 minutes, the soldiers finally left, their boots echoing down the corridor. Sarah remained motionless for another hour, her mind reeling from what she had heard. Now, watching the hangman adjust the noose around Makoa's neck, Sarah knew she stood at a crossroads. Every fiber of her being screamed that she must speak up, but fear paralyzed her. If she accused British soldiers of murder and was wrong, her career would be destroyed. If she was right but couldn't prove it, she might face charges of sedition or worse. The colonial authorities protected their own. A woman's word against that of soldiers would carry little weight, especially when that woman was defending a native chief. The commandant raised his hand, preparing to signal the execution. Makoa's eyes swept across the crowd one final time, and for a brief moment, they locked with Sarah's. In that gaze, she saw not fear, but a profound sadness mixed with resigned acceptance. He was a leader who had tried to guide his people through impossible times, and now he would die for crimes he didn't commit. The injustice of it tore at Sarah's conscience like a blade. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them. Sarah's voice cut through the heavy silence like a knife. "Stop. You cannot execute this man." Her words rang across the parade ground with surprising force. Every head turned toward her. The commandant's hand remained frozen in midair, his weathered face twisting into an expression of shock and irritation. The gathered soldiers and settlers erupted into confused murmurs, and Sarah felt dozens of eyes boring into her like hot coals. Commandant William Sterling lowered his hand slowly, his jaw clenched tight. He was a tall man with a military bearing sharpened by 30 years of service across the empire. His gray mustache bristled as he spoke, his voice dripping with barely controlled anger. "Miss Bennett, you will remove yourself from these proceedings immediately. This is highly irregular and completely unacceptable." Sarah stepped forward, her legs shaking but her resolve hardening with each step. She clutched her journal tighter, using it as an anchor to steady herself. "Sir, I have information regarding these murders. Information that proves Chief Makoa is innocent." The words tumbled out faster now, propelled by desperation and righteousness. "The Real killers are among us right now, wearing British uniforms." The crowd's murmurs transformed into gasps and angry shouts. Several officers moved toward Sarah, clearly intent on removing her by force, but Sterling raised his hand again, this time to stop them. His eyes narrowed dangerously as he studied the young translator. Sarah had served under his command for 3 years and had earned a reputation for competence and reliability. She was not prone to hysterics or flights of fancy. That fact alone made him pause. "You are making an extraordinary accusation, Miss Bennet," Sterling said, his voice cold enough to freeze water. "One that borders on treason. I hope you have evidence to support such claims, or you will find yourself in chains alongside the condemned man." Sarah's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to continue. She recounted everything she had overheard in the administrative office 3 nights ago. She described the conversation between Corporal Davies and Private Hutchins in precise detail, including their discussion about stealing the ivory, framing Makoa with his own knife, and their plans to sell the goods to Portuguese traders. As she spoke, she watched Sterling's expression shift from anger to calculation. He was a hard man, but he was not stupid, and he understood the implications immediately. When she finished, Sterling turned to his adjutant, a nervous young lieutenant named Morrison. "Find Corporal Davies and Private Hutchins. Bring them here immediately." Morrison saluted sharply and hurried away, clearly relieved to escape the tension that had settled over the parade ground like a suffocating blanket. Sterling then gestured to the hangman. "Remove the noose. The prisoner is to remain secured to the post until this matter is resolved." The next 20 minutes felt like an eternity. Sarah stood apart from the crowd, isolated by her accusation. She could feel the hostility radiating from the assembled soldiers and settlers. In their eyes, she had betrayed her own people to save a native chief. Some whispered that she had gone native herself, that she had spent too much time among the tribes and lost her sense of loyalty. Others suggested darker motivations. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her shoulders, but she refused to look away from the execution post where Makoa remained standing, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant Morrison returned with 4 soldiers escorting Corporal Davies and Private Hutchins. Both men looked confused and slightly annoyed at being summoned, but as they approached the commandant and saw the assembled crowd, their expressions changed. Davies, a stocky man with a sunburned face and cruel eyes, caught sight of Sarah and his face drained of color. Hutchins, taller and leaner, tried to maintain his composure, but Sarah saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. Sterling wasted no time. "Corporal Davies, you stand accused of murdering 3 British merchants at the Tana River trading post and framing Chief Makoa for your crimes. What do you say to these charges?" Davies's eyes darted between Sarah and the commandant. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the late afternoon breeze that had begun to cool the air. "That's madness, sir. Complete madness. I don't know what lies this woman has been spreading, but I had nothing to do with those murders. Everyone knows the chief did it. They found his knife at the scene." "How did you know his knife was found at the scene?" Sarah interjected, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "That detail was kept from public record. Only those directly involved in the investigation knew about it." Davies's face reddened. Everyone talked about it. It was common knowledge among the ranks. But his voice lacked conviction, and several officers exchanged meaningful glances. Sterling's expression remained neutral, but Sarah saw his hand move subtly to rest on the pistol at his belt. The commandant turned his attention to Hutchins. "Private Hutchins, I will ask you once and only once to tell me the truth. If you lie to me now, you will hang alongside your accomplice. Did you participate in these murders?" Hutchins's composure crumbled like a sandcastle before the tide. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes filled with tears. He was younger than Davies, barely 20 years old, and the weight of guilt had clearly been crushing him. "I didn't kill anyone, sir," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I swear on my mother's grave. I just helped move the bodies afterward. Davies did the killing with Thompson and Reed. They made me help hide the evidence. They said if I told anyone, they'd kill me too and make it look like an accident." The parade ground erupted in chaos. Davies lunged at Hutchins with a roar of rage, but 3 soldiers tackled him to the ground before he could reach his former companion. He thrashed and cursed, screaming that Hutchins was a liar and a coward. Sterling drew his pistol and fired a single shot into the air, the crack of gunfire silencing the commotion instantly. Private Hutchins, you will provide a full written confession detailing everything that happened, Sterling commanded. Corporal Davies, you are hereby placed under arrest for murder, theft, and conspiracy. Where are Privates Thompson and Reed? Thompson died of fever last week, sir, Morrison reported quietly. Reed deserted 5 days ago. He was last seen heading toward the Portuguese territories. Sterling nodded grimly, processing this information. He turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying absolute authority. This execution is postponed indefinitely pending a full investigation into these allegations. Chief Makoa will remain in custody but will be moved to better quarters and treated with the respect due to a man who may well be innocent. The stone walls of Fort William's interrogation room seemed to close in as Sarah sat across from Hutchins. A single oil lamp cast dancing shadows across his pale, tear-streaked face. Commandant Sterling stood in the corner, arms crossed, while Lieutenant Morrison took notes at a small desk. The young private's hands shook as he clutched a tin cup of water, barely able to bring it to his lips without spilling. Sarah had been asked to remain present as a witness to the interrogation. Her presence had already violated so many unspoken rules of colonial society that one more transgression hardly mattered. She watched Hutchins with a mixture of pity and disgust, knowing that his confession could save an innocent man but also understanding the weakness that had made him complicit in murder. Sterling's voice was measured but sharp as a razor. Start from the beginning, Private. Tell us everything, and leave nothing out. Your life depends on the completeness of your honesty. Hutchins took a shuddering breath and began to speak. His story painted a picture of greed, opportunity, and casual cruelty that made Sarah's stomach turn. 3 months earlier, Corporal Davies had learned from a drunken merchant that a substantial shipment of ivory would be stored at the Tanner River trading post. The merchant had boasted about the quality and quantity of the tusks, enough to make a fortune if sold to the right buyers. Davies had shared this information with Privates Thompson and Reed, both men known for their gambling debts and willingness to bend rules for profit. They had planned the robbery meticulously, waiting until the merchants received their shipment and catalogued it. On the night of the murders, the 3 soldiers had told their commanding officer they were conducting a routine patrol in the area. Instead, they had crept into the trading post after midnight, when the merchants were deep in sleep aided by generous amounts of rum. Thompson had served in India and knew how to move silently. Reed had picked the lock on the storage room where the merchants kept their valuables. Hutchins's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he described what happened next. Davies had personally cut the throats of all 3 merchants while they slept. There had been no struggle, no chance for the victims to cry out or defend themselves. The brutality had been swift and efficient, carried out by a man who had killed before and felt no remorse. Thompson and Reed had loaded the ivory onto a stolen cart while Davies staged the crime scene. The ceremonial knife had been Davies's idea. He had taken it from Chief Makoa's village 3 weeks earlier during a routine inspection. The elaborate carved handle made it distinctive and easily traceable to the chief. Davies had wiped the blade clean and then deliberately left it under one merchant's cot, positioned where investigators would be certain to find it. The plan was simple but effective because it played perfectly into existing prejudices. Colonial authorities were always quick to suspect natives of violence against white settlers, and physical evidence would override any protestations of innocence. "Where did you hide the ivory?" Sterling demanded. His knuckles were white where his hands gripped his arms, the only sign of the rage simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Hutchins provided detailed directions to a location in the forest, approximately 8 miles from the fort. They had buried the tusks in a dry ravine, covering them with rocks and brush. The plan had been to leave everything undisturbed for 6 months, allowing suspicion to fade and attention to move elsewhere. Then they would retrieve the ivory in small batches and sell it through contacts Reed had cultivated among Portuguese traders operating illegally along the coast. Why did Reed desert? Morrison asked, his pen poised above his notebook. He got scared, Hutchins explained. After Miss Bennett started asking questions around the fort, trying to learn more about the case, Reed became convinced that someone suspected the truth. He panicked and ran. Davies was furious. Said Reed's desertion would draw attention and ruin everything. Sterling pushed away from the wall and leaned over the table, his face inches from Hutchins. Why did you help them? You claim you didn't participate in the murders, but you helped conceal them. That makes you complicit. That makes you guilty of the same crimes. Tears streamed down Hutchins's face now, his composure completely shattered. I didn't know they were going to kill anyone, sir. I thought it was just going to be a robbery. When I arrived at the trading post and saw the bodies, I was sick. I vomited right there in the dirt. But Davy said if I didn't help, he'd kill me too and tell everyone I was the mastermind. Thompson backed him up. I was terrified. I'm not a killer, sir. I'm just a coward who made terrible choices. The confession continued for another hour as Sterling extracted every detail, every movement, every conversation. When it was finally complete, Morrison had filled 20 pages with cramped handwriting. Hutchins signed each page with a trembling hand, sealing his fate. He was led away to the stockade, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his guilt. Sterling turned to Sarah once they were alone. The lamplight caught the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. Miss Bennet, you have done a service to justice today, but you have also created significant problems. The colonial administration will not look kindly on this situation. A white woman accusing British soldiers of murder to save a native chief will generate controversy that reaches all the way to London. Sarah met his gaze steadily. With respect, sir, the only problem I see is that we almost hanged an innocent man. Everything else is secondary to that fundamental injustice. A ghost of a smile crossed Sterling's weathered features. You have more backbone than half my officers, Miss Bennet. Very well. Tomorrow at dawn, I will send a detachment to retrieve the ivory from the location Hutchins described. If we find it where he claims, that will corroborate his confession beyond any doubt. In the meantime, I need you to do something that will be difficult. I need you to speak with Chief Makoa and explain everything that has transpired. He deserves to hear the truth from someone he might trust. Sarah's heart quickened at the prospect. She had saved Makoa's life, but she had also been part of the system that had condemned him. She wondered if he would see her as an ally or simply as another face of colonial oppression. I'll speak with him tonight, sir. Sterling nodded. Take Lieutenant Morrison with you. The guards will grant you access. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. Miss Bennet, what you did today took courage. Real courage. Not the kind that comes from following orders, but the kind that comes from knowing what's right even when it costs you everything. I want you to remember that in the difficult days ahead. The prison cell where Chief Makoa was held sat in the oldest section of Fort William, a stone structure built when the British first established their presence in the region. The air inside was thick with humidity and the smell of unwashed bodies. A single barred window near the ceiling allowed moonlight to stream through, creating a pale rectangle on the earthen floor. Sarah stood outside the iron door, steeling herself for the conversation ahead while Lieutenant Morrison spoke quietly with the guard. When the door finally swung open with a groan of protesting hinges, Sarah found Makoa sitting on a wooden bench, his back straight despite the ordeal he had endured. The shackles had been removed from his wrists, revealing raw, bloody circles where the metal had bitten into his flesh. His eyes, dark and fathomless in the dim light, fixed on her with an intensity that made her falter. Morrison remained near the door while Sarah stepped inside, clutching her journal as if it might protect her from the weight of Makoa's judgment. She had prepared a speech during the walk from Sterling's office, carefully choosing words in Makoa's language that would convey both the facts and her regret. But now, standing before him, all her prepared words evaporated like morning dew under the African sun. Chief Makoa, she began in his language, her pronunciation careful and respectful. I have come to tell you what I have learned about the men who killed the merchants and framed you for their crimes. Makoa's expression remained neutral, but he gestured for her to sit on the opposite end of the bench. Sarah lowered herself carefully, maintaining a respectful distance. She could sense Morrison's discomfort behind her, unused to seeing a British woman show such deference to a native prisoner. She ignored him and focused entirely on Makoa. She told him everything. The overheard conversation, her fear and indecision, her final choice to speak up at the execution. She explained Hutchins's confession and Davies's arrest. She described the buried ivory and Sterling's plan to verify the story at dawn. As she spoke, she watched Makoa's face for any reaction, but the chief's features remained as unreadable as carved stone. Only his eyes moved, tracking her face with an intelligence that reminded her why he had become a leader of his people. When she finished, silence filled the cell like water filling a vessel. Sarah's hands twisted together in her lap, waiting for Makoa to speak. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity. Finally, the chief leaned back against the cold stone wall and released a long, slow breath. You tell me these things now, Makoa said in his own language, his voice deep and measured, but tomorrow I might still hang. Words change nothing until actions follow. Your people have promised justice before, Translator woman, and those promises turned to dust. His words carried no anger, only a profound weariness that spoke of decades watching his world transform under foreign rule. Sarah nodded, accepting the truth in his statement. You're right to doubt. I cannot promise what the commandant will decide, or what the colonial administration will demand. But I can promise this: I will not stop fighting for your freedom until you are released and returned to your people. I will put my name, my reputation, and my future on the line to ensure justice is done. Makoa studied her for a long moment, his gaze penetrating beyond her words to weigh the sincerity beneath them. Why? He asked simply. Why risk everything for a man you do not know? A man your people call savage. The question struck at the heart of something Sarah had been wrestling with since arriving in East Africa. She thought about the answer carefully before speaking. Because I have spent 3 years translating between your people and mine. I have learned your languages, your customs, your histories. I have sat with your elders and listened to their wisdom. I have watched mothers care for their children with the same love I saw in my own mother. And through all of this, I have come to understand that the only real difference between us is power. My people have guns and laws that favor them, and they use these advantages to commit injustices they would never tolerate among themselves. She leaned forward, her voice growing more passionate. I cannot change the entire system, Chief Makoa. I cannot undo decades of conquest and exploitation. But I can stop one innocent man from dying for crimes he didn't commit. If I fail to do even that when I have the power to act, then I am complicit in every injustice that follows. I become the very thing I despise. Makoa's expression shifted subtly, something that might have been respect flickering in his eyes. You speak well, translator woman. Better than most of your people, who see us as children or animals to be controlled. But pretty words have never freed a man from chains. Tomorrow, when your soldiers dig in the forest, they will find the ivory or they will not. If they find it, perhaps your commandant will set me free. If they do not, I will hang, and your brave words will be forgotten before the sun sets. They will find it, Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. Hutchins had no reason to lie about its location. He knows his only chance at mercy is complete honesty. The chief smiled without humor. You have faith in the honesty of men who murdered 3 people in their sleep. That is either courage or foolishness, and I have not yet decided which. Sarah couldn't help but return his grim smile. Perhaps both, Chief. I've been told I possess an unfortunate combination of idealism and stubbornness. This drew a genuine laugh from Makoa, a sound that transformed his weathered face and revealed the charismatic leader he must have been before chains and accusations wore him down. My wives say the same thing about me. They tell me I argue with mountains and expect them to move. Perhaps that is why I am here now, facing death because I refuse to simply accept your people's rule without question. The conversation continued deep into the night. Makoa spoke about his life, his people, and the impossible position they found themselves in as outsiders carved up their ancestral lands. He described the delicate balance he tried to maintain between preserving his people's identity and adapting to the new reality imposed upon them. He talked about the ceremonial knife that had condemned him, a blade passed down through 7 generations of chiefs, now tainted with false blood and lies. Sarah listened, truly listened, in a way that transcended her role as translator. She heard not just his words but the pain and frustration beneath them. She understood that Makoa's struggle was not just about his own survival but about the survival of everything his people had built over centuries. His execution would have been more than one man's death, it would have been another nail in the coffin of a culture being systematically dismantled. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting the cell in silvery light, Morrison finally cleared his throat to indicate it was time to leave. Sarah stood reluctantly, not wanting to abandon Makoa to another night of uncertainty. But the chief rose as well, straightening to his full height, and placed his hand over his heart in a traditional gesture of respect. Thank you, translator woman, he said softly. Whether I live or die tomorrow, you have given me something more valuable than freedom. You have given me proof that not all your people have lost their humanity. That is a gift I will carry with me, whatever comes. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes but refused to let them fall. She returned his gesture of respect and spoke the traditional farewell in his language. As Morrison locked the cell door behind them, she glanced back one final time to see Makoa sitting again on the bench, his silhouette strong and unbowed despite everything he had endured. The first fingers of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson as Sarah stood in the commandant's office, too exhausted and anxious to sleep. She had spent the remaining night hours pacing her quarters, alternating between hope and dread. Now she watched through the window as Sterling assembled a detachment of soldiers in the courtyard below, their movements efficient in the growing light. He had chosen men from a different company than Davies's unit, ensuring no one with potential loyalty to the disgraced corporal would be present. Sterling entered the office carrying a steaming cup of tea, which he placed in Sarah's trembling hands without comment. His uniform was immaculate despite the early hour, every button polished and every crease sharp. "The detachment leaves in 10 minutes, he said. "Lieutenant Morrison will lead them. I expect they'll return by mid-morning if Hutchins's directions are accurate." "And if they find nothing?" Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her all night. "If Hutchins lied or misremembered the location?" Sterling's jaw tightened. "Then we have a serious problem. Without physical evidence corroborating his confession, Davies's lawyers will tear the case apart. They'll argue that Hutchins concocted the entire story to save himself from punishment for some other crime. They'll paint you as a misguided woman who misunderstood a casual conversation and created a conspiracy from nothing." Sarah set down the tea, unable to stomach it. "Chief Makoa will hang." "Chief Makoa will hang," Sterling confirmed grimly. "And there will be nothing either of us can do to stop it. The colonial administration will demand his execution to maintain order and demonstrate that justice was served. They cannot afford to appear weak or indecisive." The morning stretched into an agony of waiting. Sarah remained in the office, unable to focus on anything except the window and the road leading back from the forest. Sterling dealt with routine administrative matters, his face betraying no emotion, but Sarah noticed how his eyes flicked toward the window between every document he signed. The fort continued its daily rhythm around them, soldiers drilling in the courtyard, merchants arriving to haggle over trade agreements, native workers carrying supplies to the storehouses. At 10:30, a shout went up from the watchtower. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she rushed to the window. A group of soldiers emerged from the tree line, their cart heavily laden with something covered by canvas tops. Even from a distance, she could see the distinctive shape of ivory tusks protruding from beneath the covering. Morrison rode at the front of the group, his face set in grim satisfaction. Sterling was already moving toward the door. "Come with me, Miss Bennet. You deserve to see this through to its conclusion." They met the detachment in the courtyard, where Morrison had ordered his men to unload the cart in full view of anyone present. He pulled back the tarps with a dramatic flourish, revealing dozens of ivory tusks, each one marked with the distinctive stamps used by the murdered merchants to identify their inventory. The evidence was irrefutable and overwhelming. Murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd of soldiers and officers. "We found them exactly where Hutchins said they would be," Morrison reported, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Buried in a ravine, covered with rocks and brush. The location showed recent digging and clear signs of concealment. We also found personal effects belonging to the murdered merchants, a pocket watch, a distinctive pipe, and a leather pouch containing British currency." Sterling examined the ivory carefully, checking the merchant's stamps against records retrieved from the administrative office. Each tusk matched the inventory list perfectly. The pipe bore an engraved inscription, "To Harold, with love from Margaret." Harold Weston had been one of the murdered merchants, and the inscription matched details his widow had provided during the investigation. "Corporal Davies will be brought before a military tribunal," Sterling announced loudly, ensuring everyone present heard clearly. "The charges against Chief Makoa are hereby dismissed with immediate effect. He will be released, compensated for his wrongful imprisonment, and his ceremonial knife will be returned to him with formal apologies from this command." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Some soldiers looked relieved, others appeared uncomfortable or even angry. Sarah knew that many present would resent the outcome, seeing it as a betrayal of their own people in favor of a native chief. But justice had its own weight, its own gravity that bent even prejudice toward truth. Within the hour, Makoa was brought from his cell. Sarah waited in the courtyard as guards removed his shackles for the final time. The chief stood in the sunlight, blinking after days in darkness, his wrists bandaged where the irons had cut deepest. Sterling approached him carrying the ceremonial knife in both hands, presenting it with formal ceremony. "Chief Makoa," Sterling said in careful, accented pronunciation of the native language, "on behalf of the British Crown and the East Africa Protectorate, I offer our deepest apologies for the injustice you have suffered. You were wrongly accused, wrongly imprisoned, and nearly wrongly executed. Your knife is returned to you, your honor is restored, and you are free to return to your people with our assurances that the true criminals will face the full weight of British law." Makoa accepted the knife, running his fingers along the familiar carved handle. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply holding the blade that had nearly killed him. Then he looked at Sterling with an expression that mixed acknowledgement with profound sadness. "Your apology is heard, Commandant. But words cannot return the days stolen from me, nor can they restore the trust broken between our peoples. Justice delayed is justice diminished, and the scars left by your chains will remain long after my wrists have healed. He turned to Sarah, and his expression softened slightly. But there is one among you who chose truth over comfort, justice over convenience. The translator woman whose voice stopped the rope from tightening. She has my thanks and my respect. Tell your people that if they had more like her, perhaps our children would not grow up fearing the sound of approaching boots. Sarah felt the weight of his words settle on her shoulders, both a blessing and a burden. She had done the right thing, but she had also seen how fragile justice truly was, how easily it could have gone the other way. One moment of cowardice, one decision to stay silent, and an innocent man would have died. The following days brought swift and severe consequences. Corporal Davies was tried by military tribunal, found guilty of 3 counts of murder, and hanged within a week. Private Hutchins received a prison sentence of 20 years for his role as an accomplice. Private Reed was declared a deserter and fugitive, with orders issued for his capture and execution. The speed and severity of the punishments were meant to send a message that the colonial administration would not tolerate criminality within its ranks. For Sarah, the aftermath proved more complicated. Many in the colonial community ostracized her for what they saw as a betrayal of her own people. Invitations to social functions dried up, and she found herself increasingly isolated. Some officials suggested it might be best if she transferred to another posting, somewhere her presence wouldn't serve as a constant reminder of the embarrassing incident. But Commandant Sterling stood firm in his support. He publicly commended her actions and ensured she retained her position as translator. More importantly, her actions had earned her something far more valuable than colonial approval, the respect and trust of the native communities. Chiefs from neighboring tribes began requesting her specifically for negotiations and disputes. She became known as the woman who spoke truth, and her translations carried weight because people believed she would convey their words honestly and fight for fair treatment. Chief Makoa returned to his village, where his people celebrated his survival with 3 days of feasting and ceremonies. He sent word through messengers that Sarah would always be welcome among his people, an honor rarely extended to any British official. The ceremonial knife was restored to its place of honor, though Makoa told his people the story of how it had nearly condemned him, using the tale as a lesson about both injustice and redemption. Months later, Sarah stood on the same parade ground where she had stopped an execution. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the packed earth, and she thought about how much had changed since that terrible day. Justice had been served, but the incident had exposed deep fractures in the colonial system, flaws that no amount of punishment or apology could fully repair. She thought about Makoa's words, about trust broken and scars that remained. She thought about the merchants who had died for greed, the soldiers who had killed them, and the innocent man who had almost paid for their crimes. She thought about all the other injustices, large and small, that occurred every day across the protectorate, most of which would never be challenged or corrected. Sarah knew she couldn't fix everything. She couldn't dismantle an empire or rewrite history. But she had proven something important to herself, that one voice speaking truth at the right moment could change the course of events. That courage, however terrifying in the moment, could tip the scales from tragedy to justice. That standing up for what was right, even at great personal cost, was the only way to live with oneself. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and deep purples, Sarah made herself a promise. She would continue translating, not just words but intentions. She would continue bridging the gap between worlds, fighting for fairness whenever possible. She would remember Chief Makoa's face when the noose had been removed, and she would let that memory drive her forward through whatever challenges lay ahead. Because in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the approval of those who valued power over principle, but the knowledge that when tested, she had chosen humanity over convenience, truth over silence, and justice over fear. And if that made her an outsider among her own people, then perhaps she had finally found where she truly belonged, standing in the space between worlds, speaking truth to power, and refusing to look away when